Hello, I'm Nurse Ana Clara. I've been working for over 15 years in the emergency unit of a large hospital, and I thought I had seen it all. But nothing prepared me for what I experienced on that fateful night. It was a typical night shift, calm and monotonous, until the clock struck 3 a.m. This time always felt unsettling, as if the air became heavier, filled with an energy I couldn't explain. That night, I was called to check on a critically ill patient in the ICU. I walked down the silent corridor, with only the soft hum of the machines and the occasional beep of a monitor to keep me company. When I finished attending to the patient, I felt a strange presence, a chill running down my spine. I looked around but saw nothing out of the ordinary. I attributed the feeling to fatigue and started to return to the nursing station. That's when I saw something at the end of the corridor, near the isolation ward. A figure stood there, shrouded in shadows, almost indistinguishable in the dim light. At first glance, I thought it was a colleague, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't an ordinary person. The figure seemed to be a woman, wearing a long hospital gown, but her face was a pale mask of agony. Her eyes, black and empty, locked onto mine, and a malevolent smile twisted her lips. I tried to call for help, but my voice caught in my throat. The figure began to move slowly towards me, gliding over the floor without making a sound. Terror paralyzed me, and I could only watch, helpless, as she approached. Suddenly she vanished, as if she had never been there. I ran to the nursing station, my heart pounding in my chest, and told my colleagues what I had seen. They looked at me with skepticism, but one of the older nurses, Donna Marta, turned pale. Donna Marta told us a story that chilled everyone's blood. Many years ago, a patient had died tragically in that ward. She was hospitalized with a terminal illness, and in a night of despair, took her own life. Since then, her troubled spirit had haunted that corridor, appearing to those somehow connected to imminent death. In the following days, I tried to avoid that corridor at night, but the reports of apparitions began to increase. Other colleagues started seeing the same figure, always around 3 a.m. The hospital's atmosphere became heavy, filled with palpable fear. Some nurses requested transfers, unable to cope with the constant terror. One night, I decided to face my fear. Armed with a flashlight and a cross my grandmother gave me, I walked down the haunted corridor. The silence was deafening, and each step echoed like a war drum. I reached the end of the corridor and, turning the corner, saw the figure again. This time, she was closer, her eyes fixed on mine, radiating deep sadness and unbearable anger. With the cross in one hand and the flashlight in the other, I began to recite a prayer my grandmother always said to ward off evil. The figure started to writhe, as if in agony, and let out a scream that echoed through the empty corridors. In a final flash of light, she disappeared, leaving only a trail of intense cold. Since then, the figure has never appeared again, but the feeling that something dark still lurks in the hospital's corners remains. The nights are still full of unease, and whenever the clock strikes 3 a.m., I remember that night of shadows and the terror I faced. This experience left deep marks on me, teaching me that there is more between life and death than we can understand, and that some souls, unfortunately, cannot find peace. Hello, I'm Nurse Juliana. I've been working for 10 years in an old hospital full of stories and secrets, but I never imagined I would become part of one of them. It all began on a rainy night when I was on duty in the pediatric ward. The children were sleeping peacefully, and the sound of rain hitting the windows was almost comforting. Just before midnight, I was called to check on a child who had recently been transferred to room 13. a room we avoided at all costs. Room 13 had a sinister reputation. Stories of inexplicable phenomena and ghostly apparitions were common among the staff. It was said that decades ago, a devastating fire had occurred in the hospital, killing several people, including a nurse and some children under her care. Since then, many believed that troubled souls still wandered the corridors. As I approached room 13, I felt a strange coldness, despite the hospital's central heating working perfectly. The door to the room was slightly ajar, and I could see a faint light flickering inside. I entered, expecting to find the child awake, but what I saw was completely different. The bed was empty, the sheets impeccably arranged as if no one had slept there. Suddenly I heard a whisper behind me, a faint, indistinct murmur. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. My heart began to race and a sense of panic washed over me. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the whispers continued, growing in intensity. I decided to leave the room and inform my colleagues about the child's disappearance. But when I tried to open the door, it wouldn't budge. It was locked from the inside. My panic turned into sheer terror when I realized I was trapped in room 13. The whispers became clearer and I could make out words. "Help us. We can't get out." The voice seemed to come from all around, filling the room with an oppressive sense of despair. I began to pray, asking for protection, but the words barely escaped my mouth. The light began to flicker frantically, and shadows started to move along the walls. A figure appeared in the corner of the room, a woman in an old nurse's uniform, her face pale and her eyes lifeless. She looked directly at me, and I felt a chill run through my body. Then other figures began to emerge around her, children, all with expressions of sadness and suffering. The ghostly nurse reached out her hand towards me, and a feeling of oppression gripped my chest. It was hard to breathe, and the room seemed to shrink around me. The children started to approach, their hands outstretched as if begging for help. I was paralyzed, unable to move or scream. Suddenly, the door burst open and my colleague Marcos rushed in, pulling me out of the room. The feeling of oppression vanished instantly and the ghostly figures disappeared. He asked me what had happened, but I couldn't speak. I was in shock, trembling from head to toe. In the days that followed, I tried to process what I had experienced. We discovered that the child transferred to room 13 had never arrived at the hospital. There was an error in the documentation, and no one could explain how it happened. Room 13 was permanently closed, and the hospital decided not to investigate further. I still work at the same hospital, but I avoid going near room 13. The trauma of that night stays with me, and the memories of the voices and tormented figures still haunt me. I learned that there are forces beyond our understanding, and some old stories hold more truth than we want to believe. Room 13 keeps its secrets, and I prefer not to discover anything more about them. Hello, I'm Nurse Clara. I've been working at Central Hospital for nearly 12 years, and although I've witnessed many strange and inexplicable things, nothing prepared me for the terrifying experience I had one night. The hospital where I work is known for its long and often dark history, but what happened that night exceeded all my expectations. It was a cold and rainy night, and I was on duty in the psychiatric ward. The psychiatric ward is always a bit unsettling, especially at night, with its long silent corridors and the occasional muffled scream from a patient in crisis. That night, however, something was different. There was a heavy, almost palpable atmosphere, as if something invisible was watching my every move. Around midnight, the nursing phone rang. The voice on the other end was weak and whispering, almost like a moan. "Clara, come to the therapy room." The line went dead before I could respond. I was perplexed, as the therapy room had been decommissioned for months since a patient had committed suicide there. Even so, I felt an inexplicable need to go there, as if an invisible force was pulling me. As I walked down the corridor, I felt the temperature drop drastically. My breath condensed in the cold air, and each step echoed like a war drum. When I reached the door of the therapy room, I hesitated. A deep sense of fear gripped me, but something inside me insisted that I had to go in. I pushed the door open carefully and was enveloped by oppressive darkness. In the middle of the room, I saw a figure with her back to me. She seemed to be a woman, with long, disheveled hair and a dirty, tattered hospital gown. Before I could speak, she began to whisper, "Why didn't you save me, Clara? Why did you let me die?" The voice was full of pain and despair. My heart raced, and overwhelming panic consumed me. I knew the voice belonged to Elisa, the patient who took her own life in that room. I remembered her clearly, a young woman tormented by voices and hallucinations. I did everything I could to help her, but she seemed beyond any help. Now her ghostly presence confronted me with a guilt I didn't know I carried. Elisa's figure began to turn slowly, and what I saw terrified me. Her face was pale and deformed. Her eyes were empty sockets, and a macabre smile twisted her lips. "Come with me, Clara. We'll be together forever," she said, slowly advancing towards me. I tried to retreat, but my legs were rooted to the floor as if invisible roots held me. Elisa kept approaching, and the sense of despair and terror grew within me. I started to pray, trying to ward off the malevolent presence, but the words seemed to have no effect. Then I felt a cold hand touch my shoulder. I screamed and turned quickly, coming face to face with my colleague Sophia. She was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Clara, what are you doing here? We need to get out now." Without waiting for a response, she pulled me out of the room. As we crossed the door, I felt the temperature return to normal, and the sense of oppression vanished. Sophia told me she had heard my scream and came running to help me. We both knew something supernatural had happened, but we decided not to tell anyone. The hospital is a place of science and reason, and ghost stories are not welcome. Since that night, I avoid the therapy room, but the memories of Elisa and her haunted voice still haunt me. The experience left me feeling vulnerable and deeply uneasy. I learned that no matter how much we try to understand and control the world around us, there are forces beyond our comprehension that can arise at any moment, especially in the most unexpected places. The midnight whisper is a constant reminder that some wounds never fully heal, and some spirits never find peace. My name is Emily, and I had been working as a nurse at St. Luke's Hospital for almost 5 years when the incident occurred. It was an autumn night, one of those that leaves the air heavy with an unfulfilled sense of expectation. As usual, the corridors were quiet and bathed in a cold light that seemed to amplify the silence. Anna, a new addition to the nursing team, was assigned to the night shift. She was young and full of enthusiasm, but also carried a noticeable vulnerability in her eyes, something I attributed to the natural tension of dealing with critical patients in a hospital setting. As I made my own rounds, I could see Anna advancing down the distant corridor, where the rooms seemed to whisper stories of times past. With each step she took, a dark and indistinct shadow appeared at the end of the hallway. At first, I thought it was just a trick of light, or my own tiredness starting to play tricks on my mind. But as Anna approached, the shadow materialized, taking shape as if it were its own entity, something that did not belong in the world of the living. I kept my distance, watching her as she faced the unknown, with a courage that I wasn't sure I would have. The atmosphere around us changed noticeably. The air grew heavier, as if the hospital itself was holding its breath. Lights began to flicker irregularly, as if someone were playing with the switches far away. The feeling of not being alone intensified with every passing second. When Anna finally reached the point where the shadow loomed strongest, I found myself holding my breath along with her. The shadow stretched down the hallway, defying logic and explanation. I wanted to scream for her to turn back, to run away from there, but the words died in my throat. Then the cold began, an intense cold that seemed to penetrate to the bone, enveloping everything around us in a frosty haze. Anna tried to speak, tried to scream, but the sound was lost in that dark mass now moving toward us. I ran to her aid as the shadow seemed to stretch out, as if to embrace her. But before I could reach her, Anna fell to her knees, sobbing in fear and terror. I held her, trying to calm her breathing as she trembled like a leaf in the wind. We returned to the nursing station, both in shock. Anna tried to explain the inexplicable, but her words were fragmented, disconnected by the experience she had just lived through. I knew no one would believe us, not with that absurd story of living shadows and supernatural cold. Since then, what I saw in that corridor has haunted my dreams. The shadow, that indescribable presence that seemed to watch us that night, continues to haunt me. A constant reminder that there are mysteries in this world that defy our rational understanding. My name is Daniel. As a newly graduated doctor, I was tasked with reviewing old records in the abandoned ward of the city's central hospital. It was a stormy night, with the wind howling through empty corridors and rain beating against broken windows. The darkness was oppressive, as if the building itself was trying to swallow me whole as I navigated through the shadowy halls, lit only by the flickering light of my flashlight. The abandoned ward was a labyrinth of desolate rooms and corridors that whispered tales of forgotten patients. Rumors among the older staff whispered about a nameless patient whose presence haunted incomplete and time-stained medical records. It was said that this patient was an unsolvable enigma, a presence the hospital preferred to forget. As I sifted through dusty files, the feeling of being watched grew with each step. Shadows danced on the walls like specters from the past, clamoring for justice. Finally, I reached the room marked 333, its door creaking ominously as it swung open. The interior of the room was a macabre time capsule, a solitary bed covered with sheets that were once white but now yellowed with age and neglect. A swinging lamp cast grotesque shadows on the peeling walls, creating a palpable atmosphere of horror. With a lump in my throat, I approached the bed where the nameless patient lay. I pulled back the sheets carefully, revealing a body in an advanced state of decomposition. His eyes, open in a fixed and empty stare, seemed to pierce my soul with a silent accusation, as if holding me responsible for his abandonment. The air grew thicker, laden with a sweet and putrid odor that nearly made me recoil. Before I could fully process the horror before me, the door behind me slammed shut with a deafening crash. I spun around in panic, finding myself locked inside the room with the decaying corpse. A chill ran down my spine as I heard shuffling footsteps echoing through the empty corridors. Each sound was a macabre promise of something approaching, something that no longer belonged in the realm of the living. My heart pounded uncontrollably as I frantically searched for an exit, each passing second increasing the sense of despair enveloping me. Hysterical screams began to escape my lips, mixed with a sinister laughter that seemed to reverberate off the concrete walls. My thoughts became a cacophony of fear and confusion. struggling to comprehend what was happening and how I could escape this living nightmare. In the oppressive darkness, I saw shadows moving on the walls, contorting like living beings as they drew nearer. My body trembled uncontrollably, my reasoning clouded by the terror surrounding me. I knew in that moment that I was trapped in a deadly game with forces beyond my understanding, a game whose outcome seemed inevitable and terrible.